Here, we'll start with roll call this time.
Benjamin Novosel,
Here.
Mark Thurnauer,
Here.
Pat Haggerty,
Here.
Barry Petrocco,
Here.
Damian Scope.
Here. All right, did everybody have a chance to read through the meeting minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think that's the only item on the agenda here, so does anybody have any comments or questions on the meeting minutes or last month's training session? No? Okay, is there a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. Minutes are approved, and I think we can just jump into the continued training session.
All right. Hello, everyone. Tonight is the second presentation in the two-part historic preservation training for the Design Review Board. In the first part, I went over the basics of historic preservation, including why preservation is important, background information for the National Historic Preservation Act of '66, the National Register of Historic Places as the country's list of places worthy of preservation, and the criteria for eligibility that sets the standard for the field of historic preservation, including assessing significance, placing that significance in the appropriate historic context, evaluating integrity, and the various preservation briefs and standards used in the field to ensure appropriate rehabilitation of historic properties.
Sorry, hey Wes, real quick, before you dive in, could you just introduce yourself for the...
Oh, yes. I am Wes Cunningham, the on-call historic preservation consultant for the City of Fort Thomas.
Thank you.
Last presentation, while I tried to tie it into Fort Thomas specifically, it was by design more broadly set in the general field of preservation and how it is applied across the country. In this presentation, I will focus solely on Fort Thomas, the historic preservation efforts that are currently in place, what those mean, how I assess effects to historic properties in Fort Thomas to aid in your decisions, and the process of preserving properties in the area, steps used to assess appropriate replacement materials, etc. Hopefully, this will aid the Design Review Board in your very important job. So, Fort Thomas has 3 districts that have preservation guidelines that require the Design Review Board input before alteration, demolition, or construction. The Town Center Business District, outlined in blue at the top of the map, marks a secondary area of commercial growth and development in Fort Thomas after the Midway District. It originally consisted of primarily residential buildings with some commercial, municipal, and social buildings as well. But as the population and the interest in Fort Thomas grew in the mid-20th century, this district expanded as well, becoming more of a commercial/business corridor as well as the civic center for the city. The Midway Business District, outlined in red, is the original commercial corridor in Fort Thomas, developed around the turn of the century to provide services to the nearby military installation and the growing residential core. The yellow boundary is Tower Park. I highlighted the boundaries of the National Register of Historic Places listing for the Fort Thomas Military Reservation District. This includes most of Tower Park, the residential streets along Pearson Green and Alexander Circle, as well as the larger military buildings and the iconic tower. All 3 of these districts speak to a specific and significant era of Fort Thomas's history. Combined, they tell the story of the city's growth and expansion along Fort Thomas Avenue. Scattered throughout the rest of the city are residential neighborhoods and enclaves that are not beholden to any design guidelines, at least not from a historic preservation standard. I will talk about each of these 3 districts in a little more detail. The guidelines for each are roughly based on the Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. I've had Kevin print off the document's introduction and the 10 standards that guide the entire document that all of these guidelines are based on. These are very important and are kind of considered the major preservation principles. And as I mentioned this, like I did last time, I will kind of briefly explain the figures I use. So this is very clearly an aerial showing Fort Thomas with the three districts outlined in different colors. The Town Center Business District and the Midway Business District are both bound by the design standards put in place in 2002. They were intended to provide the specific standards that would be applied to all buildings within the Central Business District zoning classification. The goals of the design standards are to benefit the citizens, businesses, and property owners of Fort Thomas through aesthetically pleasing streetscapes and architecture, improved environment for business, and renewed economic vitality with a focus on historic compatibility, preservation, and enhancement over complete replacement. This is important because this refers to both the replacement of materials as well as the replacement of resources or buildings. As I've mentioned before, many of these guidelines and standards were taken almost verbatim from the Secretary of Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which are great and the benchmark for proper preservation set by the Secretary of Interior and the National Park Service. However, as a result, they are vague in places and misleading in others. In addition to providing a list of what projects need review and a timeline and process for applying for approval, the guidelines outline the general ideas around the standards, such as repair instead of replace and ensuring compatibility with the character of the districts, more specific guidelines on renovations and rehabilitation, direction on new additions and new construction, allowable streetscape and landscape elements, signage, demolition, etc. Again, the way these guidelines are written provides some ambiguity, giving this board a much more daunting task of deciding what is appropriate, what is in line with the guidelines, and what should be allowed. I will go into more detail on each facet of the document shortly, but first I wanted to provide some overall insight into the districts and their boundaries. The 2002 document provides little to no explanation on the justification for the boundaries, but instead seem to be relying on the area's zoning. The Midway Business District includes all of the National Register listed Fort Thomas Commercial Historic District, but extends further to the south of the National Register boundaries. The Town Center Business District is not listed, but I resurveyed it last year and determined that it is eligible for listing. Both the National Register listing of the commercial district and my report outlines contributing versus non-contributing resources, but the guidelines do not provide any different approach for one or the other, except in one place that seems to be an accidental inclusion, since in the document itself there were no determinations of contributing versus non-contributing. This should be remedied, and in my assessments, I try to take that into account, but we'll get into that a little bit more later. With the figures that I used on the left are the buildings that are included in the Midway District. That's a screenshot from the design guidelines itself. On the far right are the boundaries of the Town Center Business District on a map that I made for my resurvey last year. And in the middle is from the Kentucky Heritage Council, the State Historic Preservation Office, GIS map that shows all surveyed properties in the state of Kentucky, National Register listings, etc. So you can kind of see it. This was kind of the best I could do. It doesn't allow me to manipulate it too much. But you can kind of see outlined in blue is the district, is the National Register Fort Thomas Commercial District, and like I said, it extends just about a block and a half further south, the Midway District does, than the National Register District. Here are the general design guidelines overview. I have removed a few that are redundant or that I will go into more depth later, as well as the bullet on non-contributing structures that says non-contributing structures should strive for enhancements that are compatible with the character of the district, because this document does not outline what is contributing versus non-contributing. The general overview reads, the removal or alteration of historic material or distinct stylistic features is to be avoided. Wherever possible, repair rather than replace. If replacement is necessary, replicate the original as closely as possible. And I will warn you all now, a lot of these you'll hear a few times tonight because these are important principles in historic preservation. New additions, construction, or infill should be compatible with the existing buildings, its neighbors, and the overall character of the districts. Do not assume that a later addition or alteration to an old building is worth less just because it's not part of the original building. Additions made at a later time may have gained historical significance on their own. Use styles, materials, and colors appropriate to the districts. Setbacks are to be based on those of abutting properties. Streetscape enhancement within the Town Center Business District should be consistent with the Central Business District Master Plan. And the board encourages adherence to the provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It cut off there at the bottom. So that last one is just to say that even if a proposed project might not meet the letter of the standards completely, it does defer to the ADA if the changes don't meet the standards, but they're proposed to make the building ADA compliant. There are several subsections in the design guidelines that discuss each aspect of rehabilitation projects that fall within its purview. While they are very important, I don't think it is the best use of time to go through each one line by line. Instead, I will reiterate the key takeaways while highlighting some of the more important aspects as well as more commonplace requests. A lot of this will seem redundant, but that is by design as these are integral to preservation. Retain original materials and styles. This refers to all aspects of a building or structure, from roof line, roofing material, window material, size and symmetry, character-defining features, etc. When repair of these features is not possible, they should be replaced in kind or with appropriate replacements, and we will get into those later. Fenestration, which is the arrangement of windows and doors on a building's facade, should be maintained, and the rhythm of such should not be altered. This includes preserving all window and door openings as they are, not adding new ones, and when replacement is necessary, replicate the size and shape to maintain that rhythm. Do not cover or remove original materials. They should be repaired, restored, and reused whenever possible. If they must be replaced, use in-kind material. Do not cover character-defining features. This can include decorative corbels, pediments or columns, or even historically significant materials such as brickwork or decorative tile. Cleaning and repairing materials, particularly masonry, should be done in a way that the material will not be damaged. Furthermore, when repair is necessary, it should be done using the appropriate techniques and material. For removing paint from wood or brick buildings, use hand scraping, solvents, or a heat gun. Never sandblast, as it can cause irreparable damage. Avoid using synthetic siding and trim to replace wood siding, as it rarely duplicates the appearance and can harm the wood underneath. There is guidance for when it will be allowed, and it should be reviewed on a case-by-case basis, weighing how it will affect the appearance of the building. Paints and colors, while something that I personally do not put much stock in because it is not as permanent as the other changes, are outlined in the guidelines. It stipulates that while paint colors are not restricted, except for intense or arresting colors, such as fluorescent paints, they should be historically appropriate to the era of the building and should fit the architectural style. One thing that I will say regarding painting is that the painting of brick should be avoided, as it is typically not good for the building. First and foremost, design guidelines are not instituted to prohibit new construction, but instead aid in ensuring that they are compatible within the historic and visual characteristics of the districts. Essentially, new additions and new construction should not take away from the significance, aesthetics, integrity, or harmony of the districts. This includes scale, or the overall size of the building, the specific height and width compared to neighboring buildings, setbacks from the street, roofline contours, massing, and rhythm of the facade. This also refers to the specific design of the building in terms of architectural style and features such as windows, doors, detailing, and exterior materials. These should be considered on a case-by-case basis, taking into consideration the surrounding buildings, the nature of those resources, and how they appear to the passerby. The guidelines also go into detail on public streetscapes, private landscaping, and private streetscapes, including walls, fences, lighting, ground surfaces, and awning and signage. These are pretty clear-cut in the design guidelines and require less nuance. They are simply rules and regulations that each applicant must take into consideration. I'll provide some insight on exterior items, though, later in the training. This is a screenshot taken from the design guidelines to kind of give an idea of what we're talking about modern infill and new construction, on what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. On the left, you'll see kind of an example of the harmony and the of the rhythm of the fenestration, how the neighboring buildings all kind of have the same appearance, windows and doors, storefront on the first floor. The one on the right shows an appropriate infill versus inappropriate based on the size, the massing, and the scale of the new buildings. And I'm not sure why it's cutting off the bottom of some of these slides. I apologize. Demolition is a touchy subject for many reasons. Some people see demolition of historic buildings as a necessary path towards progress or development, while others see it as something that should never be allowed under any circumstances. I will not try to convince you all one way or another, as you likely have your own thoughts toward demolition. Instead, I will outline what the design guidelines state and what I proposed in my resurvey of the Town Center Business District as additional language that should be taken into consideration when these instances arise. The design guidelines state, in line with the preservation philosophy, demolition of structures within the districts, particularly historic structures, should be avoided, if at all possible. But I will note that the guidelines do little to identify what is considered historic and what isn't, highlighting some of the same issues that I brought up earlier between contributing and non-contributing. Proposed demolition may only be approved by the board in the following cases, and these are on the slide. The structure is deemed a public health or safety hazard by the city building inspector. The owner provides a written report performed by a licensed structural engineer or architect noting structural damage sufficient to render rehabilitation as unfeasible. The report shall clearly outline all deficiencies of the building and cost estimates for rehabilitation. The extent of the total rehabilitation costs necessary to bring the structure up to compliance with the city building/property maintenance code is deemed to place an unreasonable economic hardship on the owner, as determined by the board, compared with demolition/replacement costs for the structure. The guidelines go on to state additional factors that should be considered, such as overall significance and historic compatibility of the building within the districts and instances of partial demolition. For further guidance on how to address demolition requests, I outlined a series of recommended steps in my resurvey of the Town Center Business District. They are as follows. Establishing contributing and non-contributing resources, which will be useful in establishing how the district is preserved. First floor commercial additions to contributing resources may be removed if there is sufficient evidence of what the building looked like prior to the addition, or in an effort to better preserve the original, more substantial historic resource. This is particularly pertaining to the stretch of buildings on the east side of North Fort Thomas Avenue between Lumley Avenue and the City Building. While these commercial additions have acquired historic significance in their own right, they may be removed in an effort to preserve the better building. In order to remove these additions, all efforts must be made to bring the facade of the original building back to its former appearance, adhering to the Secretary of Interior standards. If plans are presented to remove these additions but leave the original facade altered, then they should not be accepted and the commercial addition should remain. The demolition of resources within the districts should be further regulated based on a set of rules typical of similar locally designated historically significant districts. Demolition should only be allowed if the circumstances meet one of the following criteria. The building or addition is a non-contributing resource. The demolition is for an inappropriate non-historic addition or non-significant part of the building and will result in an addition that does not adversely affect significant parts of the building, is not exceedingly visible from the street, and will not adversely affect a significant streetscape. Emergency demolition and demolition due to economic hardship. It should be noted that emergency demolition must be accompanied by a letter from a city inspector who deems that the building is a detriment to the safety of the public. Furthermore, it should be noted that an economic hardship inherently refers to the economic viability of the building itself and not of the property owner. In order for an applicant to be granted an economic hardship, they must be able to demonstrate that the Secretary of Interior standards for the building are financially prohibitive to any owner of the building and not just causing an economic hardship on the current owner. It should also be noted that there is such a thing as demolition by neglect, which should be monitored and not used for justification under economic hardship, as it is a self-made hardship, not an economic one. While none of the latter ideas behind how to handle demolition requests are formally in the design guidelines as they appear today, they are things that I think would benefit the districts and standards by which I will evaluate such requests. And there's no definition of demolition by neglect here, but as the name implies, it is an owner acquiring a building, letting it fall into severe disrepair, and then claiming economic hardship after the fact. For Tower Park, I will pass this to Kevin for clarification here in a minute, as I know there is a new Tower Park overlay district in the zoning ordinance, but for my purposes, when I refer to Tower Park, I refer to the areas that are currently regulated by the Design Review Board, all of which are within the National Register listed Fort Thomas Military Reservation District. These are Green Street and Pearson Street, both of which have regulations stipulated in their HOAs, and the third is Alexander Circle and Cochran Avenue. All of these have language that more or less mirrors the Secretary of Interior standards, but are particular to the homes in the area that they govern. The former two instances are governed by the HOAs that I believe are currently being disbanded, but the latter, the houses on Cochran Avenue and Alexander Circle, have specific guidelines outlined in a memorandum of agreement between the Department of Veteran Affairs, the City of Fort Thomas, and the Kentucky Heritage Council, the State Historic Preservation Office, stemming from the sale of the land. This MOA was put in place as mitigation for selling the property, as that was considered an undertaking by a federal agency which, if you remember from the first presentation, triggered Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. I will pass it to Kevin to clarify the ongoing guidance for Tower Park overlay, and we'll follow up with a little more in-depth look into the MOA that continues to regulate additions, rehabilitation, and new construction in the 12.5 acres deeded from the VA to the city on Cochran Avenue and Alexander Circle.
So we've obviously had some things before us for Alexander Circle. There's a very specific set of guidelines for Alexander Circle. We are currently working on, to clarify one item, the Pearson Street HOA is going to be disbanded. They're in the process of disbanding that. Green Street seems to be intact at this point. There was discussion that may or may not consider that, and it seems like they're going to stick together. That being said, we are currently in the process of creating a subdivision plan that's going to divide the lots on Pearson individually, and creating very specific covenants associated with those that are reflective of primarily the document, the HOA document that was in place. So once we do that and we solidify everything, we're going to create a formal policy and procedure for how to move forward, and we're going to get that to you all. Wes will still be involved with these evaluations of these structures, depending on the scope. Like we've talked about before, if there's something relatively simple, we know it's not contributing, and once we get deeper down the path, there's elements that we don't need to call on Wes for everything. But in all likelihood, we're going to err on the side of caution if there's any question whatsoever and have Wes evaluate. But we don't have all the precise language associated with the Pearson Street documents and the covenants just yet. And I don't want to speak out of turn, give information that's not accurate or incomplete. So we're going to make sure that's all in place and then create a formal policy, get you all a copy of that, and then obviously Wes will be involved in those evaluations. So the difference is with Pearson is that they're going to have property associated with each of those buildings now versus just the footprint of the building. So it may change some of the elements of what they can and cannot do. You know, I think in talking with Wes, the facade of the building, the front of the building is obviously the most important, and some of the things that maybe they could consider to do in the back might not be that important. But we want to make sure we do our due diligence before we put our stamp on it and make sure everybody's collectively on the same page as far as what those will look like. You know, can folks do things that aren't necessarily regulated by zoning, such as, you know, arbors or trellises or flagpoles, bird baths? You know, how strict do we want to get with that in those rear yards that regular throughout the rest of the city is not really an issue? And I'll say that it's not terribly visible behind the homes, but we obviously want to take care in that and before we finalize the document. So that's where we're at on those. And I think that I'm hopeful that over the next month or so we'll have, you know, a good document that we can put together and be able to provide a little more guidance. And once again, in the meantime, as with all these, you know, Wes is going to be providing some input. You know, we have some formal, he mentioned he did an evaluation of this district, created contributing and non-contributing status to those. And whether that's fully in place or not, it's definitely something that he can perform evaluations on anyway. You know, so I think that we'll be continuing to move forward and get you a little more information at that point on those. And you know, we're going to have a good report for you for anything. We talked, I know Pat brought up, and we talked about some of the new zoning regulations for the other business districts. And, you know, I think you guys had one before you on Alexander Pike, and Mark laid that all out with what we need to evaluate. And that'll be a little outside of Wes's purview, but we want to make sure that we're, you know, we'll definitely have a good, thorough report for you all, you know, for any of those instances.
And to follow up on what Kevin was saying, so I will touch a little bit on my thoughts on things in backyards and things like that, some of which is pretty clear in preservation principles that I'll touch on later on secondary facades, and some are in later in the presentation for kind of future ideas of what, you know, typically is and isn't allowed in somebody's the rear of the house. And currently, while I'm about to go into kind of a little bit more detail on the MOA in Alexander Circle and Cochran Avenue, the HOA documents, which you can see just a screenshot of the original deed that put those in place on the right up there. Those are, like the design guidelines, are pretty much based on the Secretary of Interior standards. They are a little bit more particular to the houses that on Green Street and Pearson Street, but for the most part, they follow the basic preservation principles I just kind of went over in the design guidelines. And as always, to tell you what we're looking at, on the left is the original parcel layout that was put in place for Green Street when they, in the same deed, that outline, what parcels we were talking about in terms of what the HOA would govern for historic preservation. In the middle is from the MOA. It shows the entire deeded property from the VA to the city. That's along Alexander Circle and Cochrane Avenue. And the last is just a screenshot from the deed, because I figured you all were probably tired of looking at slides that were nothing but text.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
On that area. What is all included in that? The VA hospital is in that area?
So,
I'm sorry.
no, so included in the MOA is just the 12.
I know that's just
Okay.
residential, but we're
Yeah.
also, when it was created as a historic district,
So, as it stands, the entire Military Reservation Historic District covers everything that was associated with the original fort, the mess hall, the gym, all of the residences, the tower, everything. If we go back, you
I
can,
don't believe it includes the VA hospital. I think that's separately zoned, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have the map in front of me. I can run down and get that, but
well,
I
no,
don't,
it's just.
I think it's
If you
the-
look at that, there's some areas in there that over time should probably go through some changes.
Okay.
VA hospital, as far as our vision statement, there were some ideas about that. There's the, what do they call it, the stables, doing something there from a commercial basis, like having that. I don't know whether the Army Reserve buildings are in that.
so
area.
as it stands, the only buildings that I'm aware of that are beholden to design review oversight are the residential areas of Tower Park. Now, they're all included in the National Register District, and I could be speaking out of turn just because nothing has come across my desk that, of a request on any of those other buildings. But the documents that I brought up, the HOAs and the MOA, only refer to the residential buildings. While all of them are in the National Register District, as we talked about last month, being in a National Register District does not put any stipulations or prohibitions on what can be done to a building. Being in the National Register is kind of purely for posterity, for lack of a better term. It is there for recognition. It is there for, it opens up doors for certain incentives.
Tax credits and different.
But
things.
as a document that has any kind of teeth or protection ability, being in the National Register does not offer anything other than, like I talked about before, any kind of federal mandated. So what stipulated the MOA putting in place was the federal undertaking that triggered Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. Though anything that happens that triggers 106 will take extra care not to negatively impact anything that's nationally listed in the National Register. So other than that little bit of protection against any kind of federal undertaking, being in the National Register does not offer any kind of protection against changes to the buildings, changes to their integrity, up to and including demolition. Now, I know you all, the city would never consider demolishing any of these buildings, but just something that I find myself having to clarify with a lot of people, especially as I list National Register districts, that there really is there's nothing in the National Register that prevents a property owner from doing what they want.
Even if it's individually registered?
Even if it's individually, I have seen, personally, I got a building listed in Louisville that I went back to show a colleague of mine on an area or on a street view 6 months later, and it had been demolished. It's sad, but at least my extremely well-written document is at least in the record. And I took great pictures, so we have that.
Okay.
and just to reiterate, I believe that's correct. I think it is just the residential structures, Green Street, Pearson Street, and Alexander Circle that are technically in that historical overlay. Our buildings aren't. Now, certainly, we want to, be compatible and everything of that nature, but, and take those things into consideration, but I believe it's just the residential.
Okay.
Does anyone know on the residential properties, like when they are made aware of those guidelines existing, so they're going to close on the property, is like their title research supposed to pull that up, or how?
So in Tower Park, for these three, these are all written into the legal documents. It should become aware when they buy the building. There is typically, a check mark. Is this, that the seller, is this building listed in any kind of overlay district, anything like that? And since this language is actually recorded in the deed books in the city, they should be made aware then. For local overlay districts like Midway and the Town Center Business District, I don't know if there was ever a formal process of, I would guess that in 2002, when the design guidelines were put in place, that there was an effort made to make everybody aware. Now, whether or not that has continued to pass to each successive owner, I'm unsure. But for these residential areas, since it is in the deed and in the language of the legal documents, they should be aware when they buy the property.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think Wes is right on, with the Midway and the Central Business District, that I don't think there's a formal deed attachment associated with that, and I think that that's where folks get a little awry at times. But even beyond that, in the residential areas of Tower Park, it's similar to, somewhat ignorance of the law. They might be signing 25, 100 documents when they're closing, not realizing what they're signing, initialing, and there's usually conversation between homeowners, and that they're made aware of those types of things, but those things squeak through too, so.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, the overlay is just part of zoning, and you have to look into the zoning to figure out what it is, but
Well, and that's part of why we wanted to get this into our zoning ordinance, that, more people are aware of it, and when a realtor's involved and a realtor sees that, feels that, it's just another layer of transparency that trying to get that message out there. That's kind of partially why we wanted to do this as well.
yeah.
While I will not go into too much detail outlining every guideline and regulation in the MOA for Alexander Circle and Cochrane Avenue, as that would take a really long time, I will stick to some of the main preservation principles that are included, each of which then has more in-depth site-specific language that regulates the area. And I do want to reiterate that when this was created, the MOA was created between the city, the VA, and the SHPO. These were created by preservation professionals at Kentucky Heritage Council, so these tend to be a lot more site-specific and a lot more cumbersome in places. Each of these more in-depth regulative areas is under a heading that refers to a different aspect of each building. Overall, the idea is that the original materials should be maintained and preserved at all costs. If that is not feasible, then they should be replaced in kind or as closely as possible, matching size, design, etc. In some cases, replacement materials may be used, given that they meet the Secretary of Interior and the Kentucky Heritage Council standards typically employed on rehabilitation projects. I will get into replacement materials later. And just to kind of specify what I talk, Kentucky Heritage Council does not necessarily have their own set of standards. They defer to the Secretary of Interior, as do most state historic preservation offices. But they do have personnel there who specifically handle historic tax credit projects, and most of that job is essentially taking the Secretary of Interior standards, applying the standards of rehabilitation to tax credit projects to make sure that the proposed work fits the standards. So here are some examples of the more in-depth site-specific language in the MOA. For structural systems, preservation principle number 1, maintain and preserve the structural systems of the building. This includes character-defining features such as decorative cornices and ensuring that nearby excavations don't undermine the structural stability of the building. Masonry, preservation principle number 1. Original masonry elements that are important in defining the overall historic character of the building shall be retained, preserved, and properly maintained. This stipulates that these features, such as decorative corbelling and brickwork, must be preserved while also outlining appropriate methods for cleaning. Wood, preservation principle number 1. Original wood elements that are important in defining the overall historic character of the building shall be retained, preserved, and properly maintained. In other words, synthetics may not be used to replace or cover existing wood siding, and character-defining wood features will be preserved and repaired accordingly. Preservation principle number 3, non-compatible replacement siding should be removed and replaced with historically appropriate wood siding. I don't believe this is relevant anymore because none exists. However, if a homeowner does replace without approval, they should remedy the mistake. Roofs, preservation principle number 1, original roof forms shall be preserved. One cannot alter original form or pitch on facades seen from the public right-of-way. This includes dormers and decorative ornamentation like turrets. And that, I touched on something there that will be a recurring theme, and that is visibility from the public right-of-way, which again kind of opens up freedom for the property owner to do things that they want on non-public facing facades. Windows, preservation principle number 2, original window sashes shall be preserved and maintained. Repair rather than replace window sashes whenever feasible. Principle number 3, replacement windows shall match the original windows in dimension, material, and design. Entrances, preservation principle number 4, non-compatible replacement doors shall be removed and replaced with historically appropriate wood doors. This includes main entryways as well as rear and side doors. Preservation principle number 5, storm doors shall not interfere with or distract from the design of the original door. Porches, preservation principle number 2, when replacement is necessary, the new feature shall match the original in design, profile, color, texture, and materials. It goes without saying that the porches shall be repaired rather than replaced whenever feasible. Ornamentation. All other character-defining exterior ornamental details not specifically discussed in these design guidelines shall be preserved, maintained, repaired, and replaced in accordance with the Secretary of Interior guidelines for rehabilitation. New construction, preservation principle 1, new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not obscure or destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. Principle number 2, new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be completed in such a manner that, if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. Preservation principle 3, additions and new construction shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the historic materials, features, size, scale, and proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property and its environment. Now, I realize that's a lot, and there is a lot more to that document, but I wanted to give you an idea of how strict some of these regulations were, and that they must be followed per the MOA. In the pictures here, pretty obviously, two pictures of the same building. One was taken when the Tower Park Historic District was listed in the National Register, I believe, in 1979. And the second is that same building as it looks today on our friend Google, showing that while there have been updates and changes to the building, a lot of which were done when the VA transferred ownership, it still retains its integrity, the same appearance. It more or less looks the exact same, if not better now than it did when it was listed. The COA process for Fort Thomas is the same for all of the city's districts. It is expected that all property owners in the districts recognize the implications of owning in the areas and the guidelines that they are beholden to. And this kind of goes to what we were talking about. I am not aware of any formal notification to the property owners of their responsibilities, but there should be certain disclosures at the time of purchase. And as Kevin told me earlier, the city's economic development director helps to serve as kind of a catch-all for new businesses coming to the city and letting them know of the guidelines. First, the property owner must submit a certificate of appropriateness that outlines in detail the work that is proposed. This should include the overall scope, the building materials proposed, and any other exterior changes that the undertaking entails. This is due the first Tuesday of the month if they are to be on that month's review board meeting, which is held typically on the fourth Thursday. Examples of projects include new construction, additions, demolition, exterior renovation, material replacement, etc. This form, which a screenshot can be seen, can be found on the city's website under departments/forms and brochures. Also on the website, property owners can find the design guidelines and procedures in their entirety. The city then assesses the project and its scope and decides the next steps. The design guidelines outline the design review and approval authorization schedule, complete with which projects require staff approval and which require board approval. If it requires board approval, the city can then decide whether to assess and make recommendations in-house or to send the request to me for my opinion. If the application can be addressed by the city's staff, then they make their recommendations, complete with justifications and reasonings based on the proposed work and whether or not it satisfies the guidelines. If the application is sent to me, then I make my recommendation based on the guidelines, the scope of work, and my expertise in the field of historic preservation and my understanding of the best practices. Once the reports have been compiled, they are made available to the board, who then meets to discuss the proposed work and make their determination. It should be noted that my report provides recommendations based on my understanding of the proposed undertaking and whether or not I think it's appropriate. My recommendation is just that, a recommendation. Ultimately, this board has final say on approval or denial. And I can let Kevin touch on any instances where it may go to planning or anything like that in addition to coming before you, but I did want to provide just a quick outline of the COA process in case you all were unaware and in case anybody who's watching might be unsure on how to maybe apply through the city.
We do have a policy in place that discusses when certain projects need to go before the Planning Commission. They include things like, obviously, additions or any, new buildings and such, but when a certain amount of, I don't have the policy in front of me, but I think it includes a requirement for additional parking, if there is a change in the scope of the business such that it's going to be a change in the amount of vehicular traffic or pedestrian traffic. Some pretty basic things that, all in all, are kind of common sense to a change to the existing building. So that's when it would also go to the Planning Commission.
One of the things that Kevin and I thought would be beneficial for this is for you to understand my process when I review an application. Last training, I went in depth into preservation best practices, the criteria for eligibility set forth by the National Park Service, and the aspects of integrity. My detailed understanding of the process, my experience evaluating buildings and districts for eligibility for listing in the National Register of Historic Places, and assessment of integrity gives me specialized insight into the questions that may arise. So I figured it would be a good idea to let you all know what I consider when preparing my reports and recommendations. Firstly, I assess the scope of work and assess how it fits the design guidelines for the district in which the property is situated. Again, these change based on where the project is located, whether it's in the Alexander Circle, whether it's on Pearson Street, or whether it's in the Town Center Business District. On the surface, does the project meet the guidelines and preservation standards? If so, my recommendations are pretty straightforward. If it actively goes against the guidelines, or if the proposed work is in a gray area that is not as cut and dry, then I dive deeper and look at the language in the guidelines and infer which preservation standards most closely align with the work being done. In these cases, one of my first steps is to make a site visit where I assess if the proposed work is visible from the public right-of-way. If it is not, and it does not pose a threat to the integrity of the building, then there is a greater leeway with what is allowable. Additionally, I look at the nature of the resource in question and assess whether or not it should be considered contributing or non-contributing. While those formal delineations are not mentioned in the guidelines, the characterization is important for the practical application of preservation. I look to National Register listings, my own survey work, and I look at the district as a whole, evaluating its historic context, its integrity, and the integrity of the resource in question. This aids in deciding how stringent one must apply the guidelines. I must also take into account all aspects of the proposed work and assess each facet separately. For instance, if a rear addition is being proposed alongside the replacement of a historic entryway, I would evaluate each separately and recommend each accordingly. Ultimately, it comes down to what is allowed by the guidelines, whether or not the work would affect the integrity of the building, whether or not it would affect the integrity of the district as a whole, and if it meets the established preservation principles. Furthermore, I take into account the recognized best practices in the field when something falls outside of what is expressly written in the guidelines. By approaching the proposed work through the lens of a preservation professional and assessing whether it meets the guidelines in both the way they were written and in the spirit in which they were written, then most projects become clear on what should be recommended for approval and what should be recommended for denial. Again, I just kind of used boilerplate photos. Down at the bottom left is a screenshot from the design guidelines showing some windows that are allowed, windows replacement that is allowed, not allowed, as well as shutter replacements that are allowed versus not allowed. There's a screenshot of one of my reports and the cover of the Secretary of Interior Standards and the National Register Bulletin, how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation. There are important considerations one must note when assessing proposed work. These are all taken into account when I make my recommendations and should also be considered by the board. One is there is no precedent in preservation. Just because previous work was approved does not mean similar work on a different resource should be approved as well. While the board might be concerned with consistency, it is not beholden to previous decisions. These issues have come up in the past where work was okayed before, but as another property owner proposes to do similar work, something that goes against the guidelines, the first instinct is to approve it because it's been allowed before. This is not necessarily the case. This board is not bound by their previous decisions. Whether or not formal contributing or non-contributing status has been assigned the buildings in the district, it is important to have a basic understanding of the district as a whole, including its history, its aesthetic qualities, the integrity of its resources, and how each property fits into the district as a whole. Having an understanding of what makes something contributing or non-contributing is important. When assessing proposed work up to and including demolition, one must consider any potential adverse effects to the district in which it is situated. This applies to exterior rehabilitation, demolition, and new construction. As districts, these collections of resources must retain integrity as a whole or as a single entity as opposed to a bunch of singular resources. If one key resource is lost or heavily altered, it might affect the entire streetscape and thus the integrity of setting and feeling. Similarly, if there is new construction that is wildly at odds with the character of a district, it can detract from the district's integrity, thus drastically affecting its ability to convey significance and importance. Demolition, it is not typically sanctioned by preservation, nor does it meet preservation principles. Just as individual preservation principles state that repair is always preferred over replacement, the same goes for wholesale demolition. Adaptive reuse and rehabilitation is better than losing a piece of our built environment. Preservation does not waver on this to accommodate economic development. Instead, it argues that preservation is good for economic development. While I'm not saying that everything should be preserved at all times and at all costs, no matter what, I am saying that these overlay districts are in place for a reason, to maintain the historic integrity of Fort Thomas. Moreover, as I said before, I believe that there should be allowances for partial demolition of certain buildings and the full-scale demolition of others, particularly non-contributing buildings. However, tearing something down just because people want to build something new is not justifiable in the eyes of historic preservation. There are usually better choices available. Just because something is old enough does not mean it is significant. This is an important one. There is a saying in historic preservation that if everything is important, then nothing is important. While we use the 50-year rule to determine when a resource reaches historic categorization, being historic and being historically significant are two different things. For instance, just because a building within one of these districts is 100 years old, it does not mean that it would be considered contributing to the district. This is especially true for individual buildings, where the threshold for significance is a little bit higher, because it must all rest on the single building instead of the district. But just because a house is 100+ years old, if it is not historically or architecturally significant, then it would not be eligible for listing on the National Register, which, as I explained last time, is the benchmark for determining what is worthy of preservation. This leads me to my next point. Integrity must be retained for significance to be conveyed. One of the most common ways that this board will see a building that is technically historic be deemed not significant is due to a loss of integrity. One such example was brought up in my last presentation in the case of the West Banco. But there is another that has been brought to my attention in the past, and that is the convenience store behind the bank. The bulk of that building actually dates back several decades to when there were adjoining storefronts facing Fort Thomas, with the rear building likely acting as a storage. Also at that time, there were residential buildings just to the south of that building where the parking lot now is. The building as it stands today has been severely altered and is lacking sufficient integrity. Thus, while it is old enough and it is in the district, it is not considered contributing in my resurvey because it lacks integrity. In the picture, we've got one Highland up in the top left. Right there in the middle is one of these examples where the one-story addition on the front could be removed by the new standards that I proposed for non-contributing. The top right is that convenience store, the strip mall. I mistakenly called it convenience store. The strip mall up there that is actually very old but has been heavily altered. And the bottom right is one of the former residential buildings that has been turned to business here in the Town Center Business District. One of the biggest questions that comes up when discussing design guidelines and historic preservation is the use of replacement materials. As you have noticed, standard preservation principles state that repair comes before replacement. However, it is commonplace on historic buildings that materials are too deteriorated to allow for repair. Then the next best choice is to replace in kind. This is the preferred alternative to repair and is oftentimes easily achievable, especially since many of the buildings in Fort Thomas are constructed using methods and materials that are still widely used today. There are some exceptions, though, of materials that were once commonplace but are no longer produced today, such as asbestos shingles, which will necessitate the use of substitute materials. The standards for rehabilitation require that the replacement of a distinctive feature match the old in physical and visual properties, and, where possible, materials. While the use of matching materials is always preferred, the standards purposely allow for the use of substitute materials when the use of original materials is not reasonably possible, such as in consideration of economic and technical feasibility. They also provide additional flexibility in the treatment of secondary, less distinctive features that are less important in defining the historic character of the property, as well as missing features, new additions, and new construction.